lecture series entitled How Safe is Oil Extraction, Transportation, and Refinement in Saskatchewan. My name is Sean Tucker. I'm a faculty member in Business Administration at the University of Regina. I'm one of the speakers in this series. Today it's a pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Emily Eaton, to speak about oil extraction in Saskatchewan. This three-part series examines safety in these different parts of the oil supply chain in Saskatchewan. Speakers provide a critical analysis of environmental, community, and occupational safety across this supply chain, identify gaps in the existing regulatory regimes. There's an event coming up next week on oil transportation. It'll be in this room at same time at 1 p.m. And it will discuss, the presenter Simon Enosh will discuss oil transportation in Saskatchewan. The third and final event will be on December 2nd in this room at 1 p.m. on safety at the Co-op refinery complex. The event is being filmed and will be available to the public to view. We're going to have about an hour presentation from Dr. Eaton. After the presentation, there'll be time for Q&A and discussion. At that time, we'll stop filming. Just by way of introduction for Dr. Eaton, Dr. Eaton is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies here at the University of Regina. We first met actually at the new employee orientation session in the summer of 2009, and this is our first formal work together at the university, so it's an exciting time for both of us. Dr. Eaton is an author of a book called Growing Resistance, Canadian Farmers and the Politics of GM Wheat. She's been researching the social and political and environmental impacts of Saskatchewan's oil economy since 2011. And of note recently, Dr. Eaton, along with my colleague Dr. Stevens in the back row and other researchers across Canada, were awarded a multi-million-dollar SHIRK grant to investigate the corporate power of the carbon extractive industry in Western Canada. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Emily. Look forward to your presentation, and again, there'll be time for Q&A at the end.
Okay, how's the recording? Good? All right. First, I just wanted to thank Sean Tucker for putting this series together. I'm really excited about it, mostly about the next two presentations. He failed to mention that the one about the refinery is going to be given by himself. And I'd like to thank Valerie Zink, who came with me last year on a field trip and took photos of many of the things that we saw. So any of the photos that you see today are her photos. And finally, I'd like to say acknowledge that we are on Treaty 4 territory. And I like to acknowledge that especially when I'm talking about resource extraction, because the little bits of nature, I guess, that we call resources now, are the results of thousands of years of stewardship by Indigenous people. So it's thanks to that longstanding sustainable practices of stewardship that we now have those bits of nature which we are, in my opinion, maybe not protecting as well as we should be. So with that out of the way, I'll get started. Somebody asked me when I was distributing posters to the event, well, I think I know what you're going to say about the answer to the question, right? The question was, how safe is oil, in my case, because I'm looking at the extraction part, how safe is oil extraction in Saskatchewan? And people who know me know that I come at these questions from a sort of economic geography and environmental geography and a social justice lens. So my colleague suggested that, well, why do I need to come to this presentation? I think I already know the answer. So that got me thinking that Actually, there is a group of people for whom oil extraction is very safe in this province. This is the latest Fraser Institute, our friendly right-wing think tank, who put together their global petroleum survey in 2014. They have one usually every year, but 15 hasn't come out yet. And this is the jurisdictional rankings according to the extent of investment barriers, which are based on something that they call the Policy Perception Index, for oil-producing jurisdictions all across the world. Okay, so this is global, and you can see here I only have the top, I don't know how many are in there, 20 I think, on this slide. But what you can see is, out of all oil-producing jurisdictions the world over, the whole world over, according to the Fraser Institute, that Saskatchewan now ranks third as providing the least, I guess, investment barriers to oil extraction, right? So Saskatchewan fosters an environment that is extremely safe for industry. I heard this time and again in the interviews that I did with oil executives, with oil workers, with regulators, with all sorts of people, which I'll tell you about in a second. So the Fraser Institute here in their Policy Perception Index is looking at barriers to investment. They're looking at the regulatory climate. They're looking at political risk. They're looking at production taxes, quality of infrastructure, and other factors. So the fact that Saskatchewan there ranks 3, I think, is really telling. Alberta, for example, is way down after, I don't know how many that is there, halfway down the list, more than halfway down the list. So just to give you a sense, we're a much more safe place to produce oil than our neighboring province, Alberta. Now, if you look at their Policy Perception Index again, which shows, aggregates those things that they're concerned about, barriers to investment, regulatory climate, those things, production taxes. How do we compare within Canada? Again, number 1, no big surprise there. We have a small amount of a mild deterrent to investment, barely any strong deterrent to investment based on their survey, and a small amount that would actually prevent industry from investing in Saskatchewan. So again, just to show, and if you look at Alberta there, surprisingly, right, they actually have a much worse Policy Perception Index, and again, this is through the eyes of the oil industry, than Saskatchewan does. So I wanted to put that in context then to say that Saskatchewan is a very safe place to produce oil if you are an oil company, right? And if your business is extracting oil. But what I'm interested in with mostly in this presentation is a few other actors that barely ever get any sort of play in media, especially in media in Saskatchewan, who tends to ignore that there's even an industry here at all. And so I'll be looking mostly at sort of social and environmental factors, and I'm basing what I'll present today mostly on interviews with regulators, farmers, landowners, and actually some more folks who are on the next slide. So I'll make a couple key contentions today. One is that Saskatchewan is increasingly the site of what someone like Andrew Nikiforuk would call bottom of the barrel production of unconventional and experimental oil extraction techniques. That is that most of the oil that is easily accessed, we do still have conventional oil production happening in the province, but most of the oil that is easily accessed is by now gone or dwindled. And so the things that are propelling oil extraction in the province tend to be these unconventional techniques. These technologies, I would argue, are inherently risky, partly because they're new, and one of the factors of risk is uncertainty. So we don't know as much about them as we do about older technologies. They allow for the production of heavier and harder to reach oil, and in one case, immature oil. I'll tell you more about that in a second. And they use more water and energy to extract and upgrade. Okay, so that's the sort of nature of the current oil industry in Saskatchewan. And I'll make the contention as well that the regulatory environment for oil and gas in the province is insufficient. How do I know this? Well, Sean mentioned that I've been investigating the oil industry in Saskatchewan since 2011. I've done more than 60 interviews with regulators, landowners, oil workers, the staff from the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration who run community pastures, or who used to run community pastures. Those have been divested now to the province. with environmental consultants, with municipal councillors, with police chiefs, with addictions and mental health providers in oil booming areas, and many more folks that I couldn't think of on the spot and didn't include in this slide. I also did quite a bit of participant observation in the major oil producing areas in Saskatchewan. So last summer, I traveled in a trailer and stayed in campgrounds in the major oil producing areas of the province. And that allowed me to sort of talk to folks who were also traveling to those areas for work, in a sort of informal setting, and just sort of hanging around in those rural areas. You can ask me more if you want later about my methodology. So I mentioned that we have these bottom of the barrel, we're producing bottom of the barrel oil using a bunch of unconventional extraction technologies. What are some of those? One of them that has been increasingly the focus of a lot of concern in other jurisdictions is multi-stage horizontal fracking. And I specifically say multi-stage horizontal here because if you ask the province, they'll tell you that they've been fracking here for 50 years. And it is technically true. They have been fracking here for 50 years using single frac jobs on vertical wells. But the thing that's sort of getting more international attention recently, especially in the United States and oil plays like the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, where there's been a lot of well water contamination, is actually multi-stage fracking combined with horizontal drilling. Uses a lot more water, more potent chemicals, although we don't know much about them because they're proprietary to the industry and therefore not subject to disclosure. So we have been doing multi-stage horizontal fracking. I'll show you a map of that in a second. We've also increasingly invested in thermal technologies, including steam-assisted gravity drainage, which allows us to get heavier oil out of the ground, and cyclical steam stimulation. And we also have a fair amount of oil now being produced through enhanced oil recovery. So these are on oil fields that have been already depleted using conventional techniques, and then they'll come in with either water, carbon dioxide, if you've been following the media lately with the Boundary Dam project. Cenovus has been using CO2 flooding before Boundary Dam came along, but certainly now they have a much increased supply of CO2 for their CO2 floods, polymer flooding, and other flooding techniques to get the oil that is at the bottom, or I guess, yeah, the oil that can't be extracted with other techniques out through these. So this comes from the Geological Survey of Saskatchewan. I've added two things. You can tell which ones I've added because they don't quite match up with the ones that were on the slide from the Geological Survey. But we produce in the Lloydminster area mostly heavy oil. The light oil there along the western side of the province is mostly in the Viking formation. The medium oil there is in Shaunavon formation mostly, and light to medium in both the Bakken formation, which you might have heard a lot about because of the rapid development of that through horizontal fracking in the United States. It extends into North Dakota, but also in other oil fields in that same area. We have two additional projects there that have been stalled. There was some early development, but as far as I can tell, they're currently not being developed. And that is there near Hudson Bay oil shale, which is not the same thing as shale oil, which makes it really confusing. But oil shale is basically immature oil. It's Carrigan. It needs to be retorted before it can be, well, sometimes they retort it after they've extracted it. But it would need a huge amount of energy applied to it to sort of mimic geological processes before it could be turned into conventional oil. So that's quite a controversial technology. It's not, the company there isn't making any progress right now. And then we also have oil sands, but they are too deep to mine and too shallow to use steam-assisted gravity drainage to extract. Cenovus is up there now. There was another company, Oil Sands Quest, that Pamela Wallen was involved with, but it went belly up. They, since the 2014 crash in oil prices, they've kind of temporarily, I'm sure it will be temporarily, abandoned it. But that's sort of the lay of the land. just to show you about the current boom. So starting in the mid-2000s, actually starting in the mid-1990s with enhanced oil recovery, but really in the mid-2000s to 2014, we've had a little bit of a boom here in the province in terms of oil drilling. So this is just drilling numbers, and a lot of the boom is actually based on drilling programs and not on extraction itself, right? So a lot of the jobs that are associated with oil activity come from the drilling process. And so we're drilling, you know, over 3,000 wells, except for a couple bad wells there, or bad years there after the 2008 global economic crisis, a year in the province. That's around where we're at. Probably less now since the fall of 2014. But I don't have current numbers. I have to wait until the Ministry of Economy puts these things out and I find them on the internet, sort of by happenstance. Here you can, this is a graph that shows you a little bit better about the increase in oil production. And you can see that the increase in light oil production, a lot of that is coming out of those fracked fields in the southeast in the Bakken Formation, in the Viking Formation in the west central region. Okay, so one of the things I had an RA do with good map making skills, because I don't have them myself, is with data that I got from the Ministry of Economy. It took me several months to get this data, but finally I got it. So this is already out of date. This was the data I got in the summer of 2015, so we can assume a few more since then. But this is a map of the total oil wells in the province. So this excludes gas. I'm not going to talk at all about gas today. That's another whole story. But because gas prices have been so low, there isn't a lot of new gas development in the province. But here's a map of all the oil wells in the province. We have probably by now over 66,000. And this also excludes wells that have been decommissioned. So if we add the ones that have been decommissioned on top of that, we're getting closer to 80,000 wells in the province. And I think that's significant just to think about, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, the sort of monitoring of compliance and the regulatory atmosphere for oil and gas. Can you imagine, scattered over vast geographies? These aren't sort of large-scale industrial sites like, say, the tar sands mines in Alberta. These are individual wells scattered over the landscape across vast geographies, which makes them sort of structurally very difficult to monitor and ensure compliance on. Just to give you a sense, because people are always interested in fracking, so these are only the horizontal fracked wells. So not those vertical wells that the province likes to include in the fracking numbers. These are just the horizontal fracked wells in the province, and you can see their growth in each frame, the existing wells are gray and the new wells are darker gray. And so we have over 7,725 now in 2015, and they're concentrated in 3 formations, although a Facebook friend of mine who writes for Pipeline News, which is Saskatchewan's best source for oil and gas news, it's pro-industry, but it covers the oil and gas industry very completely, I would say, pointed out that I should have added the Torquay Formation there in the south of the Bakken there. But the 3 major fracked formations are the Viking, the Bakken, and the Lower Shaunavon. Okay, so this is a photo from our field work. This is Terry Crush, who is the president of the Saskatchewan, what's it called now? Saskatchewan Surface Rights Organization. He has a farms near the Lloydminster area. And one of the things that we've seen through our field work is, one of the things we've done through our field work is to talk to a lot of landowners who have wells on their land. So in Saskatchewan, 75% of mineral rights are held by the Crown, which means that many farmers who have wells on their land become unwilling hosts to oil infrastructure because they're only the surface owners of that land, right? They're not the mineral resource owners. And so if the province, for example, most of the time it's the province, sometimes the mineral rights will be privately owned by somebody who's not the surface rights owner, but most of the time it's the province. If the province sells the rights to the mineral, and that's underneath your land as a farmer, you have no ability to prevent them from coming onto your land. Okay, so what they call a landman will show up who attempts to negotiate a surface lease with you. And if you say no to the conditions of the surface lease, they can go to the Surface Rights Arbitration Board and be back within 9 days drilling on your land. They have a legal right to entry, in other words, onto your land to access those mineral resources. I think popular perception is that there's all these sort of farmers out there in the fields, in rural areas, getting rich off of oil and gas. And in fact, that's just really not true. There are certainly some. 25% of the mineral rights are owned privately in Saskatchewan. Those people some of whom are farmers, are getting handsomely rewarded from oil and gas development. But the majority of landowners in rural Saskatchewan who have wells on their land have become unwilling hosts. They usually get, depending on the area, around $1,500 to $3,000 per well per year. Okay. So in order to get handsomely rewarded, let's say if you wanted a $60,000 return, and you're making at the upper end of that $3,000 on your surface lease, you'd need 20 wells on your land. And at that point, if you're an active farmer, it's getting in the way of your farm operations. And so these are some of the concerns that many of the landowners have in the area. And they've begun to, the Surface Rights Organization has been around, I can't remember since when, but at least 30 years, I think. But one of the groups in the West Central section is sort of reviving itself and getting more active around surface rights and sort of publicizing the impacts of extraction on farmland, and also trying to help farmers get a better deal, I guess, from the oil industry. They're constrained again by the Surface Rights Act. There's not a lot that they actually can do. So most of the time it looks like getting more money out of it. But these landowners are, it's a really good thing actually, I think, that we have these farmers who live on this land, because they have really intimate knowledge of all of the oil infrastructure that's on their land. So here is Terry poring over a map of his farmland and all the oil leases, pipelines, and access roads on his own farmland that he's actively farming. And he's telling me about every incident of leak, spill, etc. And he takes meticulous notes about all of these things. Okay, so he's had over 30 years of experience with the oil industry on his land, and he just has like stacks and stacks and binders of infractions and incidents, many of which you would think, being the president of the Surface Rights Organization, he would get extra attention and quick remediation, but it's not the case at all. So what I wanted to do for the rest of the talk is, one, to tell you a little bit about what are the common oil impacts in Saskatchewan, based on, again, those rural peoples who are living on the land. And then I wanted to turn to what the regulatory environment is and what I see as some of the shortcomings in terms of the environmental and, well, mostly environmental regulations in the province. These are things, again, that I think often escape us as urban folks, and really haven't made the media at all. The media seems to be wholly uninterested in the oil industry in the province. You know, you hear stories about potash, about uranium, about other resource extractive industries, and you almost never hear anything about oil and gas. That's hopefully starting to change. But part of what I wanted to do is just tell you, what are the common oil impacts that are associated with oil extraction. So one of the ones that I'm particularly concerned with is what I would characterize as a significant loss of fresh water from the hydrological cycle. Now, if you ask the Saskatchewan Water Authority, which I did, they'll tell you that they're not at all concerned about it. The oil industry as a whole only uses 1% of all water allocated in roughly I can't remember which year this data is based off now, but so they use around 1% of all water in Saskatchewan that's used in Saskatchewan every year. So they're not concerned about it, it's a small percentage, but what concerns me about that 1% is if it's year after year, a lot of it is actually lost to the hydrological cycle because it's being put down very deep wells. If it flows back at all, say in the fracking process, they have to contain it, truck it to, or sometimes pipeline it, flow line it to a nearby waste disposal site. In Saskatchewan, those are often former oil wells that they're now using as disposal wells to dispose of the water. So one thing that I like to claim about the oil industry is that they're actually more in the business of waste management than they are of producing oil. So depending on the formation in Saskatchewan, you have between 75 and 95% of what you're taking out of the ground is water. So they're disposing of, and that's water that's coming from underground, not from the surface. But the oil industry is really in the business of disposing of that water through those oil wells. But they're also using fresh water, either from surface water sources or from groundwater sources. In Saskatchewan, more surface water, although there are some people selling groundwater out of Kisby, for example, in southeast Saskatchewan. The municipality of Kindersley is selling treated wastewater to the oil and gas industry. And they do use water even in non-fracking operations, but specifically a lot more in fracking operations, that then is lost to the hydrological cycle. Moreover, landowners report that not all the water that the industry uses is reported or permitted and reported. Okay, so for example, often what will happen is an oil company will show up on your land and say, oh, that's a nice dugout over there. Can we pay you to access, because you can't pay someone for water in Saskatchewan, but can we pay you to access that water? So they'll make a deal with the landowner and they'll use some of that water. And that doesn't necessarily need to be reported to the Water Security Agency. And so I would estimate that 1% is actually significantly higher. And then if we talk about fracking in particular, certainly a lot more water being used and lost to the hydrological cycle through fracking. Up to 400 semi-tanker loads for a horizontal multi-stage fracked well. And that's a Saskatchewan-specific figure because they are different depending on the different formations. And I know, for example, that the fracking that they do for gas in the Horn River of BC, they use even more water than that. But that's a figure that I got from a reputable source, water agency in Saskatchewan, but not the Water Security Agency. But I have to be careful for confidentiality purposes. So that's one thing, the water. Another significant oil impact is fragmentation and loss of native prairie due to the physical imprint of extraction. Okay, so a landowner will have a lease on their land. That lease has to be connected to a grid road through a access road. Once you have several wells, you usually then have a battery located somewhere nearby where they collect all of that wastewater that they're extracting as they're extracting oil and the oil in tanks, which are then either flow lined to waste disposal sites or often picked up by trucks. And all of this causes, as you can imagine, a lot of disturbance on the land. And the Ministry of Environment doesn't seem to be too concerned about it, especially when it's on cultivated land. And certainly I think there's less to be concerned about on cultivated land. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is a series of interviews that I did with folks from the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration who used to have a lot of native pasture lands, and that fragmentation from an oil lease and the access roads and the pipelines and the batteries and the flare stacks, et cetera, right, means that those are all sites at which noxious weeds or or just other weeds that aren't native prairie, have a little sort of beachhead, right? And they expand out into the native ecosystems. And so in 2001, it was estimated that we have about 17 to 21% of our native prairie remaining intact in Saskatchewan. I assume it's less than that now. And many environmental consultants, many of the folks at the PFRA are really concerned about how we're going to protect native prairie from this type of fragmentation. And of course, fragmentation then also impacts habitat and the species that find themselves at home in our province. Okay, I gotta move along here. This I don't think is actually a native prairie pasture, so in that way maybe it's a little misleading. I wasn't sure, I was trying to look it up today on before I came to the talk whether it is native prairie or not, but nevertheless somebody from the PFRA forwarded me this map. I don't know how well you can see it from there, but this is a map. A pipeline company wanted to build a new pipeline through the community pasture. The community pasture, the edges of the community pasture are in green. The red line is the proposed new pipeline. And in order to build it, they had to provide a map of all of the oil infrastructure that was already on the site. And so these are sections and quarter sections. So each one of these is a quarter section. So you can see, and this is one of the more impacted of the, there's certainly less dense development than this in Saskatchewan. But you can see on the high end of things, some of these things are underground, like the pipeline. I assume the flow lines are probably underground. But you can see just how dense development is it. And if that were on native prairie, what kind of damage it could potentially do to that as to the integrity of the species there. So here's a quote from this person. I think that's the bottom line, fragmentation. And when there's activity, there's going to be errors. So the more activity, the more chance there is for human error, which leads to spills, soil issues such as admixing, impacts, and erosion. Our focus has been towards topsoil preservation with development, and that's one of the most serious things I see going south with development is this topsoil loss. So the denser the surface leases, the more chance of oil risks to the soil. The map I just sent you, the one I just showed you, is on a pasture that has had a lot of development for the last 40 years. And there's everything from 40 to 50-year-old wells to last year's wells there. And what the oil industry has done with that land, I do believe this land use is in question. There's been all kinds of pipeline failures, surface spills from trucks. There's been soil issues, period. We will help out with some of them soil issues at times. Like if we have the material that's dug out of banks that we can make available for soil, whether it's topsoil or subsoil or whatever will fit, we will do that. In the pasture on the map I sent you, we have no material left on dugout banks or anywhere to make available to the oil industry anymore. And the spills are increasingly there as far as pipeline failures. Pipeline integrity is a huge issue. Wetlands are a huge issue. I would have more to say about the PFRA. On the PFRA lands, they've actually devoted a lot more attention and resources to properly negotiating things into land leases for the oil industry and in monitoring compliance, much more than the provincial government has done on their provincial lands. So one of the things I'm really concerned about too is the effects of the oil industry on the native prairies of the pasture lands as they're transferred to the provinces. But that could be a whole other talk in and of itself. So an increase in venting and flaring. I should have actually added a slide here. The chief of police of Estevan gave me a map that showed NASA satellite images. It was looking at North Dakota. You might have seen ones like that with the drastic, since the development of the Bakken in North Dakota, you can just see the place lit up at night. And you can't see the southeast as well on that, of course, because our development has been slower here. Or not as dense. But you can nevertheless see a drastic increase in venting and flaring. Well, the flaring you can see. through just nighttime satellite images. So with the oil boom in the last several years, there has been more flaring. I just looked up the new statistic. It used to be 21%, which looked worse. Now it's down to 17.4%. I don't know how they measure these because there's no measurement on individual wells looking at how much gas is leaking out of those wells. So I don't know how they come up with these statistics. But this is from Canada's submission to let me get this right. Where the heck is it? To the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the National Inventory Report. Okay, so it's their National Inventory Report from 2013, which says that 17.4% of all of Saskatchewan's greenhouse gas emissions, okay, 17.4% of the total. Now, Saskatchewan has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in Canada. More than 17% of those emissions come from fugitive sources from the oil and gas industry. Okay, so that is waste. That's what fugitive sources means, right? That's things that are being burnt off, are leaking out of wellheads, are spilling out of pipes, et cetera, right? So when you're drilling for oil, you always find associated gas. And especially when gas prices are low and there's no infrastructure in place, what we've been doing in Saskatchewan with that gas is flaring it in better cases, sometimes even just venting it into the atmosphere. And of course, it's methane heavy, and so it contributes disproportionately towards greenhouse gas emissions. So when students tell me, I like to say this at this point, when students tell me in my courses that, if we all just bike to school more, we'd be, doing something for the climate, then I suggest it would be great to do that. And I have nothing against biking. In fact, I ride my bike all the time when it's not snowing or winter. But I think there are some other places where we could make a big impact, right? So when 17% of our emissions come from waste from the oil and gas industry, something needs to be done about it. In 2012, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Economy brought in Directive S10, meant to regulate this for gas conservation. I'll give you my analysis of the regulation a little bit later, but basically it's weak and it requires operators to conserve gas only when they can show that it's economical to do so. Okay? So when it's in the interests of the oil and gas industry to conserve that gas, they'll conserve it. Otherwise, they can flare it. And finally, spills and leaks. This is one that really is of concern to landowners. And I think people have this, when I say spills or leaks, people have this imagination of like huge, massive spills with just black oil all over the place. In fact, one of the main problems from a landowner perspective is actually not so much the oil, but the salinated water. So I said that when they're extracting oil from the ground, they're also extracting a heck of a lot of water. And that water is highly salinated. And, a little small flow line going to a tank factory could have a small leak. Or when the truck comes to pick up the water from the tank, they could spill some on the ground, or the tanks could overflow. These are all what they call human error in the industry. They're not supposed to happen, right? But they happen all the time, and they generally are fairly small scale spills and leaks. But they do a tremendous amount of damage to the ecosystem, and salinated water even more so than oil, because over time small amounts of oil will break down in the soil. But salinated water basically impedes vegetative growth, and it actually just sort of spreads out over time, especially if you apply more water to it. So one Saskatchewan regulator that I interviewed said, "We have a tremendous amount of problems keeping our product where it's supposed to be." That was a regulator. And told me that there were, and you used to be able to find on the Ministry of Economy site, a spreadsheet that documented all of the spills since 1990. They've moved to a different system, and it's harder to read now. In some ways, there's more information, but it's less user-friendly. But there's been more than 15,000 spills and leaks. That's often both oil and water, sometimes just water, sometimes just oil, since 1990 in the province. So a lot of small-scale oil spills and saltwater spills happening that are really causing a lot of problems for especially folks who are attempting to use that land for farming purposes. This is one of the uglier pictures that Val took on our trip. But you can just see, these are probably water or oil holding tanks at a battery. You can see the flare there in the background. It was a wet year, last year when we were out. And so you can see that even when spills happen on the lease, in wet years, sometimes they'll carry the contaminants into farmers' fields. Farmers are really tormented by this problem. And here's just a quote to give you an example. They put a battery site over there and they had a saltwater spill there and they never told me about it at all. It flowed off lease onto my land. When I went over to see it in the spring, I couldn't figure out what the heck had gone on. Because you could see that they'd taken it and scraped something up. I couldn't figure out why they had ever done that until that year. And along the battery site there, nothing would grow. So then I kind of figured out they had a saltwater spill over there. They never said anything. And when Talisman, which was the company that had the well, took it over, or when they took it over, and I was fighting with them, I'll tell you, my sister-in-law was the one I was fighting with. And this is so common in these rural communities that everybody is so connected to the oil industry that people, landowners feel really scared to say anything about the problems that they have in their fields because they feel like they're jeopardizing their own family members' jobs if they do so, right? So he was fighting with his sister-in-law. I'd had enough. So I phoned Mines and Minerals down in Estevan. It's now called, now it's all under the Ministry of Economy. Old name for it, anyway. And they came up and I took them out and showed them. He said there was never a saltwater spill reported. So he went to Talisman. So she had to come with her tail between her legs and start paying me. So then they finally they drilled a sump and they put a culvert in and they were pumping surface water into a tank, disposing of it because there was salt water in the groundwater. And so that's also just to show that you only have to report spills if they're a certain size, and I can't remember what that is now. But there's also, again, because I said the dispersed nature of the industry, it's really hard to know if what companies are doing in the field is being reported correctly. They're really hard to monitor. Okay, I'll try to do this in 15 minutes. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the regulatory environment for oil and gas in Saskatchewan because that's the main point of the lecture series. One of the things that really surprised me when I first started, I think as Sean mentioned, my previous work had all been about agriculture. So I had a steep learning curve when I switched to studying oil. And one of the things that really surprised me when I first begun was I went to the Ministry of Environment and I asked about the process for environmental assessment on oil wells. And the guy there told me that since 1999, the ministry has been providing letters to companies opining that wells are not developments under the Environmental Assessment Act. Therefore, individual wells are shielded, or most oil and gas projects are shielded from undergoing environmental impact assessment. They don't count as developments under the Act, therefore they're not subject to environmental assessment. That might be fine on one individual well in one cultivated field. You could say, maybe it doesn't need an environmental assessment, it's just a small scale, not a development. Don't say that word because that gets people really scared. But if you think about, I said over 3,000 wells per year being drilled in Saskatchewan, that's per year, what the cumulative impacts of all of this oil development is, and none of it's going through environmental assessment, that makes me really want to push for environmental assessment. I would like to know what the cumulative environmental impacts are of all of these wells, but we don't, right? So what happens then through the environmental approval process? There are, if it's on public Crown land, then the Ministry of Agriculture gets involved. Otherwise, they're not. So if it's on private land, there's two ministries involved, the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Environment. The Ministry of Economy houses the oil and gas conservation regulations, plus two directives one of which I told you about, S10, which came into force in 2012, and S20 is another one related to venting and flaring, and a bunch of guidelines. So these, I'll tell you more about those in a second. And the Ministry of Environment reviews each project as well, but does not carry out environmental assessment, and their review is basically a checklist, and I'll tell you about how rigorous their review is in a second when I start to talk about regulation by declaration. But basically, these get approved very quickly without much oversight. So according to data provided by the Ministry of Environment's Environmental Assessment Branch, from 1995 to 2010, only 2 environmental impact assessments were completed for new oil and gas projects. So I'm guessing that those would have been larger facilities, like maybe a gas plant or something like that. Over the more recent period, this data is now kind of old, from 2006 to 2010, again, a period of intense increase in oil well licensing, horizontal well drilling, and fracking. Only 1 new oil and gas project underwent an environmental impact assessment. When the Ministry of Agriculture is involved, they can negotiate management and environmental conditions into the right of entry on provincial Crown land. And it would be really nice if they would take heed of what the PFRA was doing, because they were actually able to negotiate much better terms into the conditions of their lease. And although the Ministry of Agriculture has that power, they don't tend to exercise it or enforce it when they do. So there are these nice regulations. Some of them look, pretty good on paper. But what I really found through my research is that there's a really big difference between what the regulations are on the paper and how they work in practice. Okay, so we have 4 regional offices in the province that deal with the oil and gas industry, the regional petroleum, I can't remember what they're called now because they changed their name. Anyway, there's one in Estevan, there's one in Lloydminster, there's one in Kindersley, and there's one in Swift Current. And they each have about 4 staff in their offices. Now, if we think back again to probably close to 45 minutes ago when I had that map of the oil wells in Saskatchewan, they're responsible for 80,000 wells. And there's 4 people in 4 offices. There's 16 staff in the province who are in charge of enforcing compliance on 80,000 wells. Okay? They are extremely understaffed, and I've found through my research also extremely friendly to industry. In fact, many of them used to work in industry and have come to work, the sort of revolving door between industry and government. Now, you could say that it's a good thing that they worked in industry. They understand it. Certainly, sometimes there are benefits like that. But on the other hand, they're social networks and are, based in also their past experiences in industry. So I think there's a lot of calling in favors. That's anecdotal, but I've seen it happening. There's also something called the Saskatchewan Petroleum Industry Government Environment Committee, which was formed in 1992. They come up with all the guidelines that I told you about on the previous slide, and those guidelines include things like how to dispose of oily waste any number of things. And the industry is directly involved in the development of these guidelines, which are meant to regulate them. So the guidelines don't have the same regulatory weight as the regulations do, but the minister can always enforce them if they want. And the guidelines are meant to tell the industry how to conduct themselves. And the industry has been involved since 1992 in developing those guidelines themselves. So this SPIGEC, they call it, the Saskatchewan Petroleum Industry Government Environment Committee, consists of folks from the Ministry of Environment, from the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Agriculture, those 3 regulators. But it also includes people from the Canadian Association from Petroleum Producers, Small Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, the Canadian Association of Geophysical Contractors, and the Petroleum Services Association of Canada, all of which have a considerable amount of power and influence, you can imagine. So these guidelines are created in subcommittees with industry and government representatives. According to people that we've interviewed, there's rarely contention between industry and government members on SPIGEC. Most of the time, they all work well together. Okay? Now, environmental organizations have been called on occasion to those committee meetings to give opinions, but the regular people who sit on them, it's really a joint marriage of industry and government. So those, again, the result of those guidelines are things that the oil industry can manage, right? You get regulations then that don't inconvenience industry too much. This came from a media release that the Ministry of Economy put out. It's the newest information we have on non-compliance and inspections. But you can see, for example, just under gas, at the bottom of the list, under gas migration and surface casing vent flow. So this is, they show up at a well site and there's gas leaking out of a wellhead, for example, right? They did 64 inspections in 2012 and found 16 incidences of non-compliance. That's a quarter of the random 64 that they did. So there's a tremendous amount of non-compliance as well. And again, I think this goes back to the thing that I keep saying is that the industry is very difficult to regulate in Saskatchewan because it's dispersed across vast geographies, it's highly contracted out, et cetera. So I was extremely happy to see when the I team put out a story about oil in Saskatchewan, because as long as I've lived here, again, I did grow up in the province, but returned to Saskatchewan, I've heard almost no media, mainstream media, about the oil industry. Ed Dansock has since been shuffled, but this is a story from April, I believe. I don't know if any of you remember it. The Ministry of Economy came under some pretty intense pressure because it was found that there was a lot of sour gas. Sour gas is deadly when it's inhaled at certain concentrations. And it was found that so many of the wells in southeast Saskatchewan were non-compliant. And at that time, he was the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Petroleum and Natural Gas Division of the Ministry of Economy. And he said in that report, it's been caused in part by a lack of focus by the industry and the ministry, which is the regulator. There's been sites that have not received the attention they should. Dansock told us, okay. So our stepped up enforcement actions are starting to correct that. And they have been doing a blitz over the last year, trying to look after this particular problem. But I would note that they've only been trying to look after this particular problem once they got media attention. In this story, they talk about one oil worker who died. There are several other incidences that I've heard about, as well as animals dying from sour gas. So what's happening with the oil regulations now is that the ministry is trying to update all their processes and modernize their processes, and they're moving towards something they call regulation by declaration. And this is actually from a presentation made by the Ministry of Economy to the oil and gas industry, where they specifically state that regulation by declaration will make it easier to do business in Saskatchewan. So I guess they want to move from third easiest jurisdiction in the world maybe to first. I'm not sure. This involves, it's kind of hairy. I interviewed someone from the ministry about this process. They're rolling a whole bunch of things into one. One is sort of putting a lot of their things online and stuff. But another is actually moving away from, moving towards declaration. So what does that mean? That means that in an online system, an oil and gas company, when they're applying for a well license, will be asked a series of questions. They now will be expected to understand and know the rules and directives, which the person from the ministry told me they weren't expected to know and understand them before, which I find strange as well. But now they have to declare that they know the regulations and understand them. And while they're submitting their data, they have to declare that they are in compliance. Okay, so they make a legal declaration to say that they're in compliance with all of the regulations. And therefore, this should, in theory, free up the staff at the Ministry of Economy to then do these random audits on whether their declarations are in practice being, true or being carried out. So that's the movement that they're making. Initially, when I saw this, I was really worried about it. But in talking to them, actually, in some ways, I think it makes transparent what they were already up to. Okay, so they said basically, there was these stacks of paper. It would take, so let's say, 8 to 30 days to approve a horizontal well. And when that piece of paper actually came across the regulator's desk, it took like, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, a couple minutes, right? Because they're stamping these out really quickly. But there was this big, stack of paper sitting on people's desks. And so this process just means that oil and gas companies go online, they enter all that information themselves so that the staff at the ministry don't have to do it themselves. And they get if it's a routine well on cultivated land, okay, they get an automatic, immediate approval from all of the regulatory agencies. So they submit the data and it's approved. Now, at first, that kind of horrified me because I thought, well, nobody's looking at this. But then I realized that nobody was really looking at it beforehand either. It was just that it was, taking a long time because it was waiting for one of their staff to enter the data onto the computer. So I think in some ways, this signals to the public the kind of practice that was going on before, right? Which was basically automatic approvals on wells that the companies were declaring, basically, were routine, right? And there's a number of characteristics that make them routine that we don't have time to get into. So this is from a regulator on regulation by declaration. This is actually more about inspection. So I asked about, so they want to redeploy all the staff that used to, spend their time entering the paperwork and doing these sort of almost automatic approvals to doing now random audits. And I asked, so are those audits like paper audits, or are you going out into the field and looking at what's happening? Because companies are submitting their own data again, right? And they said, well, both, we do all these inspections too. But I think this just also shows that, those inspections are crucial to companies actually following the rules. So we've really moved industry quite a ways in the last 3 years on becoming more or less complacent about their operations. I think there was a complacency. That has improved. We've had 3,000 inspections in the Southeast now, focused on sour gas, and had very few failures. So industry's hearing us. They know we've stepped up our inspections. What we saw was a gap in communication from the operational industry folks in the field to their CEOs in Calgary. And their CEOs in Calgary thought they were in compliance because they never heard that they weren't, because nobody was looking. Now they hear that they weren't. So they're taking it seriously. And it was all based on finding a way to focus the inspections with the resource constraints that we have. It's a matter of you blitz areas. Okay, so I think what this shows is just like the sorry state of environmental compliance monitoring in the province, but also that, inspections are vital and important and can be effective in ensuring that people follow the rules and regulations. Now, there's another question about whether those rules and regulations are rigorous enough to protect all the things that we want to protect. But I think we've been failing in the province at even enforcing the regulations that we do have, which I would argue, if you look at other jurisdictions, still need a bunch of improvement. So I'll end there, and I'll take questions.
Maybe if I could just interject.
Sure.